Thank you. Thanks. Hey guys, how you doing? It's great to be here. The food was fantastic, though everybody needs to go and eat your protein afterwards because, you know, we're lacking protein. I always like speaking to people after plant-based conferences because when I go to conferences that aren't plant-based and I'm a speaker, everybody's like falling asleep. But after this food, you don't feel like you got to fall asleep, right? You feel great. We were talking about that at a conference recently. We had the Healthy Food and Practice conference at the Omni with people from all over the country. And that was kind of the conversation, is people felt great all day long and they could continue to listen to these lectures because you're not falling asleep. I go to my medical conferences and you don't want to be a speaker at 2 o'clock because everybody's out. But I really appreciate the staff. The food was absolutely incredible, as it always is. And we'll talk a little bit about vegan awareness, since that's the topic of the week, because we're aware, but a lot of the country isn't, right? I mean, you could go anywhere, and we were talking about this at the table, and you know, order a veggie burger, and they ask you if you want cheese and bacon with it, or you tell them that you're vegan, they say, but you eat fish or chicken, right? There's a lot of awareness issues out there. Are there any people here that are not vegan? One. Okay, well, we got 2 people. You'll see that it's not, you'll tend to be like rushed with people giving you love and lots of information and websites. No, good to have you. But there's a lot of people that aren't, but there's a lot of people that are asking questions and that are showing up, and that's very encouraging to me. It's especially encouraging that I'm starting to see doctors do this. And I'm starting to see this come from younger people, from the future. I know my children, we were talking about my children, one of them was like, Daddy, isn't it weird that there's chickens that run around and then there's chickens we eat? And I'm like, no, those are the same thing. And that was like a really weird thing for them. And then of course it starts getting to them, and then Thanksgiving comes around and we would go to this sanctuary in Houston, and they had a turkey there named Cooper, and that was their pet, Cooper. They loved Cooper, and then Thanksgiving comes and their cousins start eating turkey, and the tears were unbelievable. That's what happens, right? That's what we feel when we're vegan, and it's hard then to go out and inform the world because we want it to change tomorrow, and it's hard to get it to change tomorrow. But we are making changes, and we'll talk about what some of those changes are. I started completely unaware. I went to medical school. There's no talk in medical school about food and disease. There's no talk about it. I mean, I guess you kind of know, but you don't really, or I just didn't think so. It's hard for me now to look back on what I thought back then, but I basically thought we were born with diseased bodies. We were given a lemon, and it was my job to fix it, like a mechanic. And I just never thought about food. I never even thought about the patient having anything to do with their disease. So when we would round, it would be, oh, there's the colon cancer in room 101, you know, or the breast cancer in room 102. It wasn't Mrs. Smith or anything like that. So we would go and we'd see the patient, and I was like, hi, Mrs. Smith, let me look at your colon, or, you know, your belly and where the colon is. And then, oh, there's a heart problem. Okay, get the heart doctor. And there's all these doctors like around this patient. The patient's just sitting there and no one's talking to the patient, you know, and we're not making any suggestions on what you should eat. I never thought about that. I mean, with diverticulitis, we know that you're supposed to have a higher fiber diet, so I'd give people a little sheet of paper, but I didn't eat that way, and I didn't really think that they needed to eat that way. I was just told to give them this piece of paper. Then I got into weight loss, and it's weird because I go to these weight loss surgery conferences. We would sit there, the food is horrible. I mean, you know, it's cheeseburgers and everyone's going out for steak dinners, and we're talking about obesity. And in a week, and I swear I'm not making this up, I'll be there at a week surgery conference and not once till we talk about food. We're there talking about people's obesity. We're not talking about food. And then we talk about, oh, well, we did this weight loss surgery and they started gaining back weight, and what should we do about it? And people are like, another surgery? And everybody's like, yes, yes, yes. That's right, that sounds good. Another surgery is what this person needs because they were born with a surgery deficit. And then I had my first child, or my wife had my first child. And I decided I was gonna get a life insurance policy. So I go to get tested. I'm about 20 pounds heavier than I am now, 20 to 25 pounds heavier. But I didn't, you know, I was big, but you know, more people are overweight now than normal weight. And so overweight is almost normal. Like now you see someone skinny, you know, people see you like, oh, you're too skinny, you know, do you have cancer or something? And you know, I get that all the time now, but back then no one said anything to me about my weight. No one cared what I was eating until I said I was vegan. You know, when I was eating nothing but double cheeseburgers, you know, no one cared. Or like when I take my kids, I was out with a friend of mine recently and we were eating and my kids were having crudité and their kid was having a cheeseburger. And my friend said, aren't you worried about their nutrition? And, you know, and that's, you know, awareness. But anyway, so I go and get a life insurance policy test and I failed it miserably. So I had high cholesterol, I had hypertension, I had fatty liver. And this kind of blew my mind. So, you know, I talked to my buddy who's an internal medicine doctor. No problem, right? I'm going to put you on Lipitor because it should be in our water. And, you know, if you get a side effect, we'll do this. I'm going to put you on a beta blocker for blood pressure. And I'm like looking at these meds, and I know how it is because I see my patients. And these patients come in, you know, we have a little sign-in sheet and what medications are you take, and then there's a back of that. And if you need extra paper, let us know. And these patients are, you know, it's, hey, it's time for your meeting. Wait, I got to just finish my med list. It goes on. And I know that's where I'm heading. So I stopped and I said, there's got to be something wrong. I mean, do we need to be this way? Do we have to be sick? Is this necessary? And so I started studying. And I found interesting things. So the first thing I found that was interesting that I think we all know now, but I didn't know then, is that we are the sickest people in the world. This was very weird to me because I figured, come on, this is America, right? We've got the best health system in the world. We've got to live the longest, right? But with civilized countries, we live the least. And this blew my mind. How do we live the least? Because we eat a lot of protein, which might sound funny to you, but I really thought that's all we needed to do. I thought protein was it. You got to eat a lot of protein. I actually wrote a book, The Expert's Guide to Weight Loss Surgery, and if you turn to the nutrition section, it says eat your protein first. That's what I always tell my patients. Eat your protein first. If you don't eat anything, make sure it's protein, because that's what I did. And so I looked at some charts and I found that the people that eat the most, if you look at the charts of the longevity scales, and then you look at the charts of the protein intake, the countries that eat the most protein have the shortest life expectancy. And this blew my mind. This was really weird to me. And then we're very overweight. Europe's catching up with us. They did a huge study called the Epic Panacea study. 500,000 people followed 12 years, 10 different countries. Amazing study. I mean, some of the brightest minds worked on this. So the first thing is I see this study and I think to myself, why was I never taught this study in medical school? I mean, this is the ultimate study of how does food affect health. And no, if I say to a doctor right now, I could go into my hospital right now and I could go to a doctor treating heart disease, cancer, and I could say, hey, what did you think about the EPIC study? They'd be like, what EPIC study? But this is one of the biggest studies ever done on food and nutrition and illness. And the funny thing about that, I was in the field of obesity. And I ask my patients this all the time. They followed these people 12 years. What was the number one food causing weight gain? So what do you think my patients answer? Carbs. They say carbs. Every one of them says bread. Bread was inversely related with weight. So in other words, the more bread, the less you weigh. It's interesting. People like, all of a sudden bread is like this, oh my God, you're eating bread, that is a crime. Which is so weird because for thousands and thousands of years, I'm actually writing a book right now on bread. And every time I start doing the research on bread, I crave bread. So I've been eating loaves of bread. And so it's just weird to me. It's the staff of life in the Bible. It's what our civilization grew up on, and yet all of a sudden, like, people fear bread. I had who was it? Ryan Reynolds had this. He had this funny comment on Twitter. He was like, "Isn't it weird that people are so scared of gluten now that you could rob a bank with a bagel?" All right. So, what was the number one food associated with weight gain? Any guesses? I mean, we know it's going to be meat, right? But which specific meat? Chicken. Number one. And that's everybody's go-to. That's what people, that's what I'm going to eat. I mean, we talk about awareness. I had a very, very intelligent woman come to see me. She's a rocket scientist. She's overweight. She wants to lose weight. And she brings me her diet plan because they all have to bring their diet log. And she's eating eggs and bacon for breakfast, chicken for lunch, chicken for dinner. And so I say, okay, why do you think you're gaining weight? I mean, why do you think you're having a problem? And she says, carbs. And I'm like looking at her list, I'm like, but there's no carbs. So she's from Ghana, and she says, I said, there's no carbs on here, so what are you talking about? She said, well, When I was a child, we grew up eating a typical Ghana meal, and now that I've come here, I've got friends that are from Ghana, and every week, about 2 times a week, we have a typical Ghana meal, very high in carbs. So they eat, sweet potato stews, lots of beans. I'm like, that's why you're overweight? She's like, yeah. So I had happened to be studying for my book at the time, and I was like, well, that's weird because I've been studying Ghana, and Ghana has one of the lowest obesity rates in the entire world. Have you been back to Ghana? And she's like, oh, well, yeah, I did go back. And I was like, okay, are people obese there? She's like, no, I didn't see a single person that was obese. I was a total abnormality. And she's like, it was weird. I was there for 2 months, and I actually lost weight. But that's how disconnected people are because they're so entrenched in this idea of protein. And the weird thing is I started to piece through it. I started to look around the world. It turns out, so you guys heard the blue zone studies? You look at the blue zones, which are the cultures that have the most centenarians, the people living the longest lives, and you look at their diet, it's very, very low in protein. In fact, it's about 7% protein. So if you look at the Okinawans, number 1 food they eat, sweet potatoes. Number 2, rice. And then you get into some soy products, you get into some fish. Everybody says fish. That's pretty way down on the list. Very little meat. They do eat some meat, but very little. It's changing now, which is unfortunate. We have McDonald's in Okinawa. But mainly, they eat a carb-based diet. The Korean Peninsula, Costa Rica, beans and rice. Sardinians, breads, pastas, whole grains. Seventh-day Adventists. Now, you guys know about the Seventh-day Adventists? It's a fascinating population because they're a great group to study because you can't say it's the genes. They're coming from all different kind of populations. You can't say it's the environment because they live in Loma Linda, California. And they have followed 90,000 of these people for many years. Now, the interesting thing is they all believe the body is the temple of the soul. Therefore, they don't drink, they don't smoke. When it comes to meat, they vary. Some eat meat, though much less than the rest of the country. Some don't eat any meat, but they're lacto-ovo or they're pescatarian. They've got the largest vegan population in the world. About 4% of them are vegan. Great population to study, right? You would figure that the meat eaters have higher protein intake, so therefore they would live longer, but no, you'd be wrong. The vegans live the longest, have the least diabetes, which struck me. Because I thought, well, the vegans are eating the most carbs, the least protein, surely they would have the most diabetes, but by far the least, by far. And I started to see this pattern all around the world, everywhere I looked. And the pattern was interesting because everybody's eating about 7% protein. How much protein in milk? Breast milk, 7%. How much protein in animal-based milks? Way higher. Because animal-based milk is supposed to make a tiny cow into a big giant cow, and then we wonder why we're becoming big giant cows eating cow-based food. And it's interesting because when you really get into science, you could really delve down. Because there's something called a univariate analysis. So a univariate analysis is what people do all the time. They're like, it's anecdotal evidence like, oh, I've got a friend, she ate meat, she ate a vegan diet and she got fat, therefore vegan diet is bad for you. She didn't look at the factors that she was also eating nothing but vegan ice cream, all this kind of stuff. Or, you could say, what do they say, that whenever the AFC team wins the Super Bowl, the stock market goes up? There's no real causation, but it's a simple correlation. In order for science from an epidemiology to work, you got to do what's called a multivariate analysis, which means you got to look at multiple different factors that may be causing this and see if there's something else causing the relationship. And I found in these very good studies where they use that type of analysis, there kept being this correlation between meat and diabetes, and meat and prostate cancer and other cancers, and meat and obesity. But that's not enough. You can't just say that. You have to come up with a mechanism of action. What about meat makes you sick? Well, there's many things. The animal protein we love so much stimulates something called IGF1 in our body. IGF1 is a growth hormone. Growth hormone, you get bigger. It also stimulates cancers. So IGF1 has been very highly associated with breast cancer and with prostate cancer. And that kind of got me. I was like, wow, that's starting to make sense. So I've got a large population. So let's take prostate cancer, for example. Got a large population of people in Japan, and they've got a lot less prostate cancer than we do. And they eat a lot less meat. So there's a correlation there, but that's a univariate analysis. Let me look at a better multivariate analysis. So Harvard did a study on physicians, followed thousands of physicians for many years. Those that ate the most dairy by far had the most prostate cancer. Okay, now we're getting, and they did a multivariate analysis. They made sure they were controlling, there was the same amount of fiber, the same amount of vegetable consumption. The one variable that was the big variable that changed things was the dairy. Well, we know that dairy increases IGF1. Okay, so we're on to something. Now, we have kind of a mechanism of action. There's many other. If you look at meat and you look at dairy, things like that, you'll find endotoxins in them. So you could pasteurize milk, you could heat up meat, you could kill the bacteria that's in it, but you don't kill the endotoxin, which is a toxin inside the bacteria. When you eat it, it creates inflammation in your body. It's funny to me how people think carbs cause inflammation. They think if you eat sugar, you're going to become inflamed. But I could give you tons of sugar. And in fact, there was one study where they gave people a liter of Coke a day. Now, I'm not recommending you drink a liter of, Dr. Davis said I could drink a liter of Coke a day. But they gave them a liter of Coke a day, and there was zero inflammation in their body. But one of the studies that the high protein people cite the most, which was a study that showed if you eat a real high protein diet, there's a slight increase in your metabolism to break down the protein. In that study, which they don't put in the media and they don't put on the cover of the article, they had the highest level of inflammation, really high levels. They had cortisol in their urine, which means their adrenal glands are under so much stress, there's cortisol going into their urine. And there's other things. When you cook meat, you know those grill marks? If you send that to a lab, you'll find that those have something called heterocyclic amines, which are really highly carcinogenic. And there's heme iron. Everybody's like, oh, you got to get the iron in meat. The iron in meat is horrible for you. It oxidizes fat. It damages the cells in the pancreas. And so we got lots of mechanisms of action as to why meat and dairy might be causing prostate cancer. Now we got to put it to the test, though, right? And Dean Ornish did that with prostate cancer. And Dean Ornish also did it with, as did Esselstyn with heart disease. They've done it with diabetes. But they took a group of men with elevated PSA and evidence of early stage prostate cancer. So with early stage prostate cancer, you could go and get surgery or radiation. It's slow growing, so you could watch it. So they took this group of people and they put them either on a plant-based diet or on your regular diet. And then they watched the PSA. And guess what? PSA went up in the regular group, went down, reversed in the group on a plant-based diet. IGF levels go down, you don't stimulate the cancer cells, they back off. And it's not just that. Ornish did a very interesting thing. He took the blood from both people and he took prostate cancers and grew them on a gel agar. And then he dripped the blood of both groups. And the group that was on the plant-based diet killed the prostate cancer cells 8 times more effectively than the group on the regular diet. Their cells were actually primed to kill cancer. And that's a pretty, so we've got epidemiologic evidence, we've got mechanism of action, and we've got randomized controlled trials. We have it in weight loss. They did a great study called the BROAD study, randomized people, and there's been many, but the BROAD study was really good because they put people on a plant-based diet or on a medically controlled, calorie-controlled diet. Plant-based diet, they gave you no calorie restriction. So every time you go to a weight loss clinic, they tell you how many calories to eat, portion size, right? But I'll tell you, and this is complicated science, portion sizing doesn't work very well. If you give someone a little bit of food, they will be hungry. They could do it in the beginning. You've all been on a diet, right? And someone offers you a piece of cake. I don't want the cake, I'm on a diet. But 3 weeks later, they offer you the piece of cake. You're like, oh, that cake looks good. I'm gonna eat that cake. And that's because they're hungry. So here they didn't want that to happen. They wanted you to be able to eat as much as you want. So as much fruit as you want, as much beans as you want, as much lettuce as you want, as much grains as you want, you eat as much as you want. And in this study, over 1 year, the vegan group lost more weight than any study that's ever been done where people are allowed to eat as much as they want in a diet program. And so it was a really effective diet. Heart disease, completely reversing heart disease with a plant-based diet. So we've got randomized controlled trials. I always hear, oh, there's no science behind that. Just because you don't know the science doesn't mean there's no science, right? Just like because I didn't know there was an EPIC study doesn't mean there's not an EPIC study. There absolutely is an EPIC study, an advanced health study that shows all this stuff. And so when I first read this, all these studies, like, oh, I've got the solution. I felt like I was like in a movie, where, you know, what was the movie where they searching around through the Louvre to find stuff, you know, and I was like, I found the answer. I found the Holy Grail, and I'm going to take this to the world and tell them. But it's hard to make people aware. And we're doing that slowly, right? It's getting better. Every time I go to a medical conference, it's growing. There's more and more doctors going to it. The Plantrition Project, I don't know if you guys know that, it's the largest plant-based doctors conference. First time I went to it, there was like 300 doctors, 400 doctors. Now there's like 1,500. At this last conference, the whole conference was about how do we take farm-raised food into the hospitals to treat patients. Oh, that's incredible. I mean, for when I first learned all this stuff, my first thought was I go into the cafeteria and I'm like, oh my God. You know, where I trained, there was a Wendy's. And then where I practiced in Houston, one of the top hospitals for heart disease in the country, Texas Heart Institute, McDonald's. And you'd see the patient with their, IV pole and the doctor behind them, and they're both waiting to get McDonald's. Talk about lack of awareness. And it just blew my mind. So my crusade was, we got to change the hospital. It's amazing how hard it is to change a hospital. Like, we can't have this food. We can't have a cancer center and serve bacon, because the World Health Organization released a report based on 1,000 studies that showed, they grade the level of study, all right? And they have level 1 evidence that processed food is a carcinogen, processed meat. We're serving cancer patients cancer-causing materials. We can't do that. And the hospital's like, but they want it. I'm like, well, okay, if we had a rehab center for alcoholics, would we have beer? And they just sit there, they can't fathom it. Or it becomes all about one thing. So like the hospital, so I had a meeting yesterday because we're changing it at Mission Hospital right now. And they're very happy. We're gonna get rid of all sugar drinks. But it's almost like people okay, we did it, let's pat ourselves on the back, we got rid of sugar drinks. I'm like, what does that mean? So we're gonna have a person eating a double cheeseburger, fries, and a Diet Coke, and we're patting ourselves on the back? That's a total lack of awareness. So there's a lot that has to be done. And I think, number one, we have to fight this idea that our bodies need this excess amount of protein, because we don't. All right, the average woman needs 46 grams, the average male needs 56 grams. That's based on RDA studies using a normal curve. So most people need a lot less than that, but they wanted to make sure they got everybody. So that's not the minimal amount you need, that is actually the optimal amount. When you get 56 grams, you're almost certainly getting enough as a male. You probably could get 35 and do fine. Turns out we actually recycle our protein constantly. You're recycling protein as we sit there. There's protein in everything. I hate it, the FDA, the USDA came up with the food plate. So the food plate says you should get fruits, you should get vegetables, you should get grains, and you should get protein. That drives me crazy. I was like, well, grains have protein, vegetables, legumes have protein. What does, when you go to get a salad bar and you order your salad, they're like, would you like a protein with your salad? And that's like, when they ask me, I'm just like, oh, and my wife's like, oh, here we go. And I'm like, what do you mean? And they're like, well, do you want some steak or some chicken? I'm like, well, steak's got more fat than protein. So you ask me if I want fat with my salad? And the guy's like, look, I'm 16, this is a summer job, could you just... But we have to address this idea of those macronutrients. We're constantly talking about macronutrients. People go on these macronutrient-only diets where all they focus, it's if it fits your macros. That's what the diet's called. It's like you could eat whatever you want as long as it fits your macros. There's been a million studies to show that this is complete nonsense, and yet it keeps being done. And it's done partly because we are successful right now, right? There's more and more people doing vegetarian and veganism, and that's why you will see the dairy industry fighting about the term milk. That's a success for us. We should celebrate that. You will see Beyond Meat being funded like nothing ever before. Tyson wanting to offer vegetable-based meats. You will see more and more articles trying to debunk veganism or vegetarianism, or try to say, the idea that they can say that saturated fat and cholesterol is good for you is preposterous, but it's based on studies funded by the industries that want to sell it. Now, how come the regular person can't understand that an article funded by the egg industry is going to be favorable towards eggs? It's hard for me to get, but they'll do that. I don't know if any of you saw me on The Doctors. Did anybody see me on The Doctors? You should Google it if you want to see me pissed off. Because I started yelling at them. But at one point they were like, all the studies that you talk about are industry funded. I'm like, industry? What the kale industry's paying me? There's no industry funding for vegetables. There's not. That's why we talked about the USDA plate. The USDA plate, fruit, vegetables, grains, and a small quarter is protein. But how much money of our food bill goes towards fruits, vegetables, and grains, which makes up 3/4 of the plate? Almost nothing. And what it does go in terms of grains goes to the animals that we eat. So it's crazy. So when they said that to me, I was like, are you kidding? And they're like, well, you say that eggs are bad, but I've got a paper here that says that eggs are good. And says that cholesterol doesn't hurt you. Well, of course, I've read that paper. And I'm like, okay, and who funded it? It was the egg industry. So she just told me that I was doing things that were industry funded, which is crazy. And then she presents an industry funded paper. That's how crazy people are out there. And that industry funded paper, there's many ways they trick you. And it's good to understand that the layperson really can't read a scientific article. They do it all the time. So you're on Facebook fighting with a friend and there's like, oh yeah, well PubMed says this. That person has no idea about statistics. And I'll give you an example just to understand that there's no way that you could read an article and understand it unless you've had scientific backing. And not just scientific backing, most doctors can't read it. All right, they just don't have that kind of expertise as to understand how you could trick a person with a paper, because there are some tricks. So for one of them, it was that saturated fat does not cause heart disease. Have you heard that? It came out on Time magazine with a statement that said butter is back. Which was weird to me because they had a project called the North Karelia Project, where in North Korea, they had the highest amount of heart disease in the entire world. They ate lots of butter. They did a lot of things, but they drastically reduced butter consumption. And the rate of heart disease dropped, it plummeted. But butter's back. That didn't make sense to me, so I looked at the article. And what they were trying to show, it was a meta-analysis, meaning they looked at a bunch of different studies. And they wanted to show that saturated fat doesn't cause heart disease. And they showed, look, these people ate saturated fat, they didn't get heart disease. But you wouldn't see the trick that they did. And that is, remember when I told you you have to control for confounding factors? They controlled for confounding factors like you're supposed to do. And one of those factors they controlled for was cholesterol. Which means if any of the subjects in this study had high cholesterol, they were taken out of the study. Now, how does saturated fat cause heart disease? It raises your cholesterol. So if you're eating saturated fat, it raises your cholesterol, but if it raised your cholesterol, they took you out of the study, leaving only those few people left over that are genetically fortified, you know, where they can eat saturated fat and not get super high cholesterol and heart disease. Or there's studies that show if you eat cholesterol, it doesn't raise your cholesterol. Now, think about that just common sense wise. If you eat cholesterol, it doesn't raise your cholesterol. Where does the cholesterol go? So when you read that study, yes, they ate more cholesterol and their cholesterol didn't go up. But guess what? They changed their diet and they drastically dropped their saturated fat, which causes cholesterol rise. So yeah, they ate a little bit more cholesterol, but they ate a lot less saturated fat, so they had less cholesterol in the end. These tricks you wouldn't know about, but that they do. And that's why we have this confusion. And this is the meat industry trying to combat us. But there are tons and tons of research. There's a big, huge study that just came out recently that showed animal proteins associated with shortened life. It got a lot of press. There's a lot more press coming out. We also have climate change on our side, obviously. And we've got ethics. And all of those are wrapping together for a real powerful statement. It's really hard to argue with a plant-based diet. And so the point is, we should be happy about this stuff. I mean, we're a small group, but it's growing. There's more restaurants. There's more people talking about farm to table. There's more people talking about vegetables. Protein is still in our language, but I think people are starting to realize it's ridiculous. They're starting to realize you could get protein from plants. There's a movie coming out called Game Changers. Look for that. It's all about the athletes now that are eating plant-based diets and exceeding. So we have so many different levels that we're getting to the country. I'm working on the medicine side. Each of you work on your own side. And I think one day we should see a healthier life for our people, a healthier planet, and a more ethical society. So I thank you guys so much for having me. I'll take any questions if you guys have any.
In recent times, I have seen a number of stories on the internet about seniors need to eat more protein.
Yeah.
Where's that coming from?
It comes from a study that showed actually that animal protein was horrible for you until you get to 65. And then at 65, they started to see a benefit from eating protein. What it doesn't do is looks at that person's life in totality. So we have a real bad problem in elderly population with something called sarcopenia, which is lack of muscle. And so if you get to 65 and you've been eating a certain way so that you are now sarcopenic, at that point, if you continue to get sarcopenic, you're going to get sicker. So at that point, you need more protein. But you got to ask yourself why you have sarcopenia to begin with. So here's the answer. And it's going to sound crazy. Well, maybe not to you guys, but when I tell it to doctors, they go crazy. Eating animal protein actually makes you lose muscle, which blows people's minds. But animal protein is acidic. You've heard that before. Don't mess with alkaline water. That's absolute nonsense, all right? Our alkalinity and acidity has nothing to do with the actual acid level of the foods we eat. It has to do with minerals and our ability to block sulfuric acid that comes off certain amino acids. So there are certain amino acids found mostly in animal proteins that actually increase sulfuric acid. We then have to neutralize that sulfuric acid. We do it with calcium. So people that eat a really high protein diet, you will see calcium in their urine. Where do they get that calcium from? The muscles. And so years of eating that way cause that muscle loss. They did a really interesting study, and this was done by a keto group. So I don't know if you guys know Gary Taubes. He wrote Good Calories, Bad Calories, really big on eat as much fat and protein as possible. That's his. And that book is so filled with scientific error, I can't even tell you, but he's not a scientist. He's a journalist. And he started a company called Newsci. They're going to fund studies. So they fund an NIH researcher named Kevin Hall, and they're going to do the ultimate study. They're going to lock people. Who volunteers for this stuff? I have no idea. They're going to lock them in a hospital for 2 months. And one's going to be on a high protein diet, one's going to be on a low carb diet, one's going to be on a low fat diet. And they figure the high protein diet's going to do so much better, they're going to lose more fat, their metabolism's going to be better, and they're going to have more muscle. Absolutely the opposite. The low fat group did way better than the low carb group, which led Gary Taubes to change his mind? No. To criticize this and criticize that and try to ignore the data, but the data was really strong by one of the top researchers in the world. So my thought is, and I don't have a study to prove this, if you've eaten a plant-based diet all your life and you continue eating a plant-based diet, you'll be fine. You won't be sarcopenic. You could increase some of your plant-based proteins. A lot of the problems we see with proteins, there's a very strong correlation between protein and diabetes, but it's animal protein. If you look at plant protein and diabetes, you don't see that. Same with heart disease and things like that. So you could just increase your plant-based protein and be fine with it, because we have not seen a problem. People ask me that all the time. You say you don't need that much protein. What about plant protein? I have not seen a study that has shown that intake of plant protein is damaging. On the IGF1 level, soy does increase IGF1, but oddly it also increases IGF1 binding protein. So while your IGF1 levels go up, which is bad, the binding proteins go up too, so it kind of negates that effect. That's a long-winded answer, but I hope it got to what you wanted. I'm a little long-winded. Yes?
Do you incorporate all the plant-based knowledge before people have a bariatric?
Oh, yes. Very much so. Yeah. You don't just get surgery with me. You don't come in and say, I want surgery. I'm like, oh, yeah, sure, let's go to the operating room. No. We do a huge amount of stuff. I don't teach vegan diet. I mean, to me, vegan is an ethic. You know, you could be healthy and eat a little bit of animal protein. That's not my goal with them, and I don't want to drive them away. And so I approach it more. I don't really talk much about animal proteins. The word protein isn't allowed in our conversation. I talk about what foods I want them to eat. Happens to be vegan. But you know, I don't, there's a difference between what I do outside of a room with a patient and what I do in. I mean, I wear vegan belts and shoes because of an ethic. I'm not going to tell my patient they have to do that. So it's more based on a plant-based diet with my patients. But yeah, we talk a lot about fiber, a lot about plants. They have to do a diet program before not vegan, but a diet program before we do surgery. So it's a very intensive program. Yeah.
I don't add salt to my diet, so you know.
Why don't you want to add salt to your diet?
Well, I hear a lot about stomach cancer, different reasons. I mean, I don't know. So salt's okay?
Salt it up. Yeah.
No SOS is actually no LS.
Salt it up. especially when you're vegan, because the problem with salt happens when all you're getting is salt and you're not getting potassium and magnesium and you have electrolyte imbalance. That's the problem. There's a good book called Salt Fix, which goes into a lot of this research in detail. Not written by a vegan, actually, but a really smart guy who goes into the research. But if you're eating lots of potassium and magnesium and things like that, you're not going to have a problem. Now, if you're still hypertensive after eating a plant-based diet, which is very rare, okay, maybe you want to start looking at dropping salt. But otherwise, I would say eat salt and eat iodinized salt so you do get your iodine.
So no supplements.
I hate supplements.
On iodine.
I don't take any. The only supplement I take is B12 once a week. That is the only pill I put in my body. I just don't do supplements. I don't do protein shakes. Occasionally I'll do vitamin D if I felt like I haven't been outside in a long time. But I get my levels checked from time to time and it's always good. But I just really don't like supplements. I don't even like B12, but we do get B12 deficiency. It can be a problem. I feel like if we were going outside and grabbing the carrot from the ground and eating it, we would get the bacteria with the B12 in it, but we're not doing that. Could be dangerous because our soil is contaminated. So I can't recommend that. I have to tell you to take a B12. But yeah, most supplements are complete nonsense. The only supplements I would even look at might be the algae omegas. Possibly. It just depends on what your diet is. Do you have a lot of ground flaxseed in it? Do you not? What's your omega-6 to omega-3 type consumption? You may do okay with a little bit of omega algae. I used to take it. I stopped. I don't really feel like it's making a huge difference one way or the other. There's data for and against it. You do need to have a good vitamin D level. Lots of debate on vitamin D, but I do think that people need to take it if their vitamin D levels are low. You got to get at least 500 milligrams of calcium. You should easily be able to do that with dark green vegetables. But if you're not getting that, you do need to get that amount of calcium. But that's about it. Everything else is just complete nonsense.
Does it matter when you take vitamin D? Like during the morning, night?
No, it's a fat-soluble vitamin, so it's going to get absorbed and held on to.
The connection of like soy and cancer.
Soy prevents cancer.
So I have like a friend who's had breast cancer.
She should be eating soy. So there's clear studies showing that soy prevents cancer. There's clear in JAMA, Journal of American Medicine, showing that soy prevents recurrent cancer. So her doctor obviously isn't reading his literature or her literature. And they say don't eat soy because they say soy stimulates estrogen receptor. Okay, so soy is a phytoestrogen. It's not a real estrogen. It's a partial estrogen agonist. It almost works like tamoxifen. It partially blocks it, partially stimulates it. Soy does not stimulate breast tissue. It doesn't cause men to get boobs. Otherwise, I would be a double D because I eat a lot of soy. The complete absurdity of it is that there is so much estrogen in a chicken breast, like so much to blow your mind, not to mention it stimulates IGF1, that the idea of saying don't eat soy because of the estrogen effect, but go ahead and eat the chicken breast just shows you just how completely ridiculous Western medicine has become. Because these doctors have never studied this stuff whatsoever. That doctor has never even read these articles and is then giving nutrition advice to your friend. It should be criminal. But that's where we are. But yeah, soy is excellent for breast cancer. Yeah.
This came up the other day. You would recommend organic soy products.
Yeah, the vast majority of soy that we consume, not that our animals consume, that we consume is organic. I worry about some of the soy. They use hexane and you could get toluene in some of it. We got to stop somewhere. At some point, we just got to say, we got to eat what's in front of us. We were talking about this a little bit at lunch. It gets to be too much after a while. Pretty soon you're not eating anything but air because it's, it's like, it's not soy, this, that. I mean, like I would much rather my patients eat a GMO raspberry than I would, a steak. And so there's got to be a point where you say, yeah, I would love everybody to have organic, everything great, fantastic. It's expensive, it's hard to come by, and it makes everybody's lives miserable, and they're like, forget it, I'm going back to my cheeseburger. So we have to be a little bit loose with that, but yeah, I'd always prefer it being organic, yeah. Yes?
Have you heard about glyphosate recently in oat milk?
Yeah, it's terrible. Yeah, I mean, and now we're finding it in women's breast milk. It's really everywhere. But the answer to that, there's a reason that we have these pesticides. We have these pesticides because we grow monoculture crops. Monoculture crops have lost their natural defense mechanism. So therefore, we've got to put these things in there. Why do we grow large monoculture crops? So we can grow huge crops. Why do we grow huge crops? Because we have billions of animals to feed. If we didn't feed billions of animals, we wouldn't need monocultural crops, so we wouldn't need these pesticides to begin with. And that's why we got to focus even more on a plant-based diet, and especially focus on these farm-to-table type restaurants and farm-to-table to hospital type medical plans. Who do I get my nutrition news?
Anything, like health news, like who's the latest writers, journalists that you follow, they're like, oh, they're on top of this.
I mean, McGregor's pretty good. You know, it's hard for me to say because I'll see good stuff in play. Like the popular media is
It
so.
could be like small blogs, journalists, like.
Yeah, I mean, Gregor's my favorite. Nutritionfacts.org is my favorite for that. I think if you had questions and stuff, he does a pretty good job reviewing the literature. I like Forks Over Knives. You know, a lot of times I say this stuff and I know that like the people that disagree with us are going to be like, oh, he's giving you the most biased stuff. But I think they do a pretty good job going over it. There's some really good people that I follow that are not vegan that I follow because they give good advice. Like there's a guy, Dr. Nadolsky, Spencer Nadolsky. He's really middle of the road, kind of gives a very good middle of the road kind of thing. But big media type stuff. I mean, I get like most of the stuff I'm getting off Twitter. But I'm getting it off Twitter that I follow multiple scientists, and we're all talking about the latest literature that came out in the latest journal, which you guys aren't going to do. Maybe you will, but it might be boring. I mean, does anybody do it better than Gregor? I don't know. I feel like Gregor does the best job of it. Yeah. Brenda Davis is fantastic. Brenda Davis is really, really good. Yeah, Brenda Davis is great. She's a nutritionist. She wrote some really good books on being a raw vegan, and critical books too. Not like just go ahead and do everything raw, but what are the goods and what are the bads and things like that. She's really good. But I can't say for the layperson, it's really hard out there because there's just so much conflicting science and things. It's just really hard to get a good feel. You could just follow me and I'll tell you the truth. Well, guys, thank you so much for having me. Have a good day tomorrow. Have a good day tomorrow. Thank you. Thanks, man. Thanks, man.